The snowmobile had been running all night when two ice fishermen found it a little after 8 on the morning of December 15th, 2004. It was sitting alone near the middle of Swift Lake, 9 miles south of Faro, in the central Yukon territory, with its headlight still burning and its fuel tank nearly dry. The helmet was on the seat. A single mitt lay on the ice about 12 feet ahead of the front skis. 40 feet beyond that, a flashlight, lens down, battery dead. And beyond the flashlight there was nothing at all, just 4 square miles of white lake and the dark line of a pressure ridge running away to the northeast. The machine belonged to Carol Anne Beattie, 43 years old, a kitchen worker at the school in Faro, and she had called her husband at 10:50 the night before to say she was crossing the lake and would be home in 20 minutes. She was never seen alive again. There were no footprints, because 2 inches of snow had fallen overnight. There was no hole in the ice, or none that anyone could find that morning. There was only a headlight pointed at empty lake, aimed, as one of the fishermen later told the White Horse Star, at nothing whatsoever. For 19 years, that was the whole of the case. Divers went down and came up with silt. Sonar boats crossed the lake in summer grids and marked boulders and drowned timber and nothing else. A rumor grew in the absence of an answer, the way rumors do in a town of 350 people, and it attached itself to the one man who could least defend against it. And then, in May of 2024, a windstorm came out of the southeast, leaned on the rotten spring ice for 2 days straight, and Swift Lake did in one afternoon what 19 years of searching could not. This is the story of what the ice took and what the ice gave back. And there is one detail found on her left wrist that ended the rumor for good. I will hold that detail until the coroner's file can speak for itself. Before this is over, you will know 5 things about this case. First, why Carol Ann's snowmobile was stopped half a mile off the marked trail with its headlight aimed at open ice, and why the engine had been heard stopping and starting near midnight by a trapper on the far shore. Second, the single assumption search commanders made in the first 72 hours, an assumption written into the probability map itself that sent every diver to the wrong side of the lake. Third, the water science, why a deep northern lake at 4 degrees Celsius can hold a person for decades when a southern lake gives them up in days. Fourth, what an ice shove actually is, the mechanics of wind and candled ice that bulldoze the bed of a shallow bay up onto the shore in a matter of hours. And fifth, what was recovered on her left wrist, stopped at a specific minute, and how that one small machine cleared a living man's name after 19 years of silence. This account is assembled from the Yukon coroner's public findings, RCMP search records reported at the time, and interviews Carol Ann's family have given over the years. Where the record is silent, I will say so. And as with every case on this channel, it is told with the family in mind, because the people in this story are not characters. They buried someone. Faro exists because of a mine, and by 2004 it was a town outliving its reason. The town was carved out of the bush in 1968 to serve the Cypress Anvil lead and zinc deposit, one of the largest open-pit lead zinc operations on the continent, and it was named, with a gambler's honesty, after a card game. It nearly died in its cradle when a forest fire burned through the half-built townsite in June of 1969, and the whole place had to be rebuilt before anyone had properly lived in it. And for the next 3 decades, the town's fortunes rose and fell with metal prices, closing and reopening under a succession of owners. Cypress Anvil, then Kura Resources, then Anvil Range, until the operation shut for good in 1998. The population fell from a peak of over 2,000 to a few hundred people who stayed for the quiet, the cheap houses, and the country around them. Carol Anne Beattie was one of the ones who stayed. She had come north with her husband Ray in 1989 when he took a heavy equipment job at the mine, and when the mine closed he found work maintaining the town's machines, and she took the kitchen job at the school. On the evening of Tuesday, December 14, 2004, she drove her 1998 Ski-Doo Scandic, a wide-track utility machine built for hauling and trail breaking, the workhorse model half the territory owned, across Swift Lake to a cabin on the east shore that belonged to her friend Marlene Kozak. for a card night that had been running, in one form or another, for 11 years. Ray stayed home with the flu. 4 other women were at the table that night, and all 4 later gave the same account. Carol Ann left the cabin a few minutes before 11. The temperature was -31 Celsius. The sky was clear, and there was ice fog lying on the lake in low bands, the kind that forms when open water or overflow breathes moisture into air too cold to hold it, and that can drop visibility from a mile to 50 feet in the length of a snowmobile track. The crossing was about 4 miles on a marked winter trail, staked with spruce boughs every couple hundred feet in the local custom. A route she had driven, by Ray's estimate, several hundred times. She called the house from Marlene's landline at 10:50. Ray fell asleep on the couch waiting, and woke at 2 in the morning to a cold house and an empty driveway, and by 3, the RCMP detachment in Ross River had been called, and by first light the town was on the ice. What they found was the scene I have already described. The machine, idling on fumes, half a mile north of the staked trail. The helmet on the seat, which everyone who knew her said was wrong, because Carol Ann did not take that helmet off outdoors at 30 below. The mitt. The flashlight. The pressure ridge beyond, a long seam of broken and refrozen plate ice thrown up by the lake's own expansion, running northeast toward the mouth of Ledge Creek. Augers went down all around the machine that day and found solid ice, 14 inches of it. Everywhere they drilled, more than enough to hold a truck, let alone a woman on foot. Divers came up from Whitehorse on December 17th and spent 3 days under the lake, working the deep drop-off south of the machine in water pushing 200 feet, and it is worth pausing on what that work actually is. A diver under lake ice in December works on a tether because the hole he entered through is the only way out of a ceiling that runs unbroken for miles. He works in water 2 degrees above freezing, where even in a dry suit useful bottom time is measured in minutes, and the first fin kick near a silt bottom raises a cloud that takes hours to settle. So most of the search is done by feel, one gloved hand sweeping an arc in absolute darkness. 3 days of that found nothing. In June, when the lake opened, boats towed side-scan sonar over the search grid for most of a month, and side-scan has its own blindness, because a steep drop-off casts an acoustic shadow the same way a cliff casts shade, and anything lying at the base of a slope can sit inside that shadow through pass after pass. They marked boulders and drowned timber, nothing else. And one statement sat in the file all the while, quietly making everything worse. Abel Dick, a trapper with a cabin on the west shore, told police he had heard a snowmobile out on the lake close to midnight, and that the sound had been strange. The machine had stopped, idle for a time, revved, moved a short distance, and stopped again. To half the town, that sounded like a woman in trouble. To the other half, it sounded like 2 machines. And that second reading is where the trouble for Ray Beattie began. He had no witness to his evening on the couch. In a town that small, no answer becomes an accusation given enough winters, and in February 2005 Ray sat for a polygraph examination whose result the RCMP never made public, which in the arithmetic of small-town talk meant he had failed it, though a polygraph result is not evidence in a Canadian court, and an unreleased one is not evidence of anything at all. In 2007, an anonymous letter arrived at the Ross River detachment naming him outright. Investigators interviewed him again and again found nothing to act on, and the letter's author was never identified. He held on in Faro until 2010, and then he sold the house at a loss and moved to Whitehorse, and the case went into the files. The force does not call cold, but historical. Anne Beattie was one missing woman on a small lake in the Yukon. What kept her missing for 19 years is something worth understanding because the same physics is holding people right now under lakes all across the north. Start with the water itself. Fresh water behaves in a way almost nothing else on Earth does. Nearly every substance grows steadily denser as it cools, right down to freezing. Water does not. Because of the geometry of the hydrogen bonds between its molecules, it is at its heaviest, not at 0, but at 3.98 degrees Celsius, call it 4, roughly 39 Fahrenheit, and below that temperature it actually expands again. which is why ice floats instead of sinking, and why lakes freeze from the top down instead of the bottom up. So every autumn, as a northern lake cools, its densest water sinks in a process limnologists call fall turnover. And by the time ice caps the surface, the entire bottom of the lake is sitting at about 4 degrees, sealed off from the wind and the sun, and it stays there, winter and summer, year after year, in any lake deep enough to stratify. Now consider what that means for a body. In warm water, a drowned person does not stay down long. The bacteria of the human gut go on working after death, fermenting, producing methane and hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide, and within 2 or 3 days in 20-degree summer water, that gas inflates the abdomen like a slow balloon and floats the body to the surface. That is why most drowning victims in southern lakes are recovered within the first week, and why recovery teams in warm climates sometimes simply wait. But those gut bacteria are mesophiles, organisms tuned to the temperature of a living body, and at 4 degrees they all but stop. The gas never forms, or forms so slowly that the pressure of the depth, which at 200 feet is roughly 7 times the pressure at the surface, keeps it compressed into insignificance. The body simply stays where it settled. Cold water preserves, and given years, it does something stranger than preserve. In cold, oxygen-starved water, the body's own fat undergoes a slow chemical conversion called saponification, hydrolyzing into a hard, waxy, soap-like substance called adipocere. Grave wax, and adipocere, once formed, is nearly inert. The most famous demonstration of it in North America is the case of Hallie Ellingworth, a waitress who vanished from Port Angeles, Washington in December of 1937 and surfaced in Lake Crescent, a glacial lake 600 feet deep and permanently cold, 3 years later in 1940, so completely converted to adipocere that newspapers called her the Lady of the Lake, and so well preserved that the ligature marks on her throat were still readable, evidence that convicted her husband of her murder. 3 years in cold water, and the body itself still testified. Great Lakes researchers have noted the same principle for over a century on Lake Superior, whose average water temperature sits at almost exactly 4 degrees and whose depths never warm past it. More than 350 ships have gone down in Superior, and the lake is notorious, in the sailors' phrase the sans borrowed, for never giving up her dead, because the mechanism that floats a body simply does not run there. So Swift Lake was not hiding Carol Ann in any active sense. It was simply doing what cold, deep, fresh water does. And there was a second mechanism at work, one the original search never fully weighed. Ledge Creek enters Swift Lake at its northeast corner, and even in the dead of winter, under 4 feet of ice, that inflow keeps a slow current creeping along the lake bottom, bending northwest along the basin toward a wide, shallow bay on the far shore. It is a current measured in fractions of a kilometer per hour, invisible from the surface, meaningless to a boat, but do the arithmetic. A drift of even 100 meters a year, a pace a snail would find embarrassing, moves an object nearly 2 kilometers in 19 years. The coroner's report is careful on this point, and I will be careful with it too. No one can say precisely how Carol Ann traveled from where she went into the lake to where she was found. But the bottom current from Ledge Creek runs in exactly that direction, and the searchers of 2004 and 2005 were dragging Sonar, in good faith, through water she had likely already left. She is not the only one the cold has held, and the North has a quiet ledger of cases like hers. In the Northwest Territories, on the east arm of Great Slave, the deepest lake in North America, 614 meters at its deepest, over 2,000 feet of permanently cold water, a man I will call Wilfred, a 51-year-old fisherman out of a small community on the shore, went through early ice on a snowmobile in December of 1985 in a season when the freeze had come late and the crossings were lying. His family watched the lake for almost 30 years. Then came 2014, a summer of record low water across the territory when a drought year in the Mackenzie Basin dropped lake levels far enough to close barge routes that had run for decades, and a sandbar surfaced off a point where no sandbar had been in living memory, and on it were the frame of a machine and remains that the territorial coroner's office confirmed by dental records the following spring. Nothing found him. The water simply left. His daughter, who had been 9 years old when he vanished, told a CBC reporter that the family had never once moved the boat from the beach where he used to land it. Second, a case from southwest Alaska and a different kind of reveal. In the autumn of 1968, a bush pilot flying a float-equipped Cessna out of the Lake Iliamna country went missing on a short hop in weather that closed in behind him, and for 51 years he was simply gone. One of the hundreds of aircraft the Alaska wilderness has swallowed whole, in a state where the official register of missing planes runs longer than some towns' phone books, and where searchers accept that most will never be found. In 2019, a hydrographic survey crew running multi-beam sonar across the lake bottom for navigation charts, mapping every meter of bed in overlapping swaths the way the old towed sonar never could, passed over an anomaly at roughly 240 feet and found the aircraft sitting upright in the dark, remarkably intact, preserved by the same 4-degree water that holds everything else. That family got their answer not from the lake relenting, but from technology finally reaching the bottom of it. And third, the counterexample, the one that shows the other face of this coin. On November 10, 1975, the freighter Edmund Fitzgerald, 729 feet of ore carrier loaded with 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, went down in Lake Superior with 29 men aboard, 17 miles short of the shelter of Whitefish Bay, in 530 feet of water. The wreck was located within 4 days by a Navy aircraft trailing a magnetic anomaly detector, and it has been surveyed since by submersibles and divers, and in 1995 an expedition even recovered the ship's bronze bell for a memorial. The crew has never been recovered, not one man in half a century, and the site is now legally protected as a grave, in part because everyone involved understands that the lake has preserved what it holds. Superior is simply too deep and too cold, and the depth that preserves also imprisons. Hold those 3 cases side by side and you can see the shape of the rule. A deep, cold lake keeps its dead indefinitely. What brings them back is never the lake softening. It is water level, or technology, or, in Anne Beattie's case, a third mechanism. The strangest of the 3, the one that requires spring, rotten ice, and a hard wind all at once. So now, walk through what actually happened, in order because the coroner's file, released in September of 2024, answers the 5 questions this case spent 19 years asking. Begin with the ice itself, in the second week of May 2024. Spring ice is not winter ice, and the difference is structural, not just a matter of thickness. Lake ice grows in long vertical crystals, packed side by side like a bundle of pencils, and in winter, the boundaries between those crystals are frozen tight, so the sheet behaves as a single solid plate. But as spring sun warms the surface, meltwater works down through the sheet along those crystal boundaries, dissolving them first because impurities concentrated there melt at a lower temperature, and the solid plate rots from within into millions of loose vertical needles, what northerners call candled ice, because a broken piece splits into shafts like a handful of candles. Candled ice can still be 3 feet thick and carry almost nothing, and it fails without warning, crumbling like dropped glassware, with a sound old-timers describe as wind chimes. On May 9th, a southeast wind came up the Tintina Trench, the great straight valley that runs 400 miles through the central Yukon and funnels weather like a rifle barrel, and it blew sustained at 40 knots, gusting past 60 for the better part of 2 days, and it leaned on that entire rotten sheet at once. Here is the arithmetic that matters. Wind stress on ice is small per square foot, but a 4 square mile sheet offers over 100 million square feet of surface, and the sheet itself weighs on the order of 300,000 tons. A lake's ice sheet under wind is a bat. On her left wrist was a quartz wristwatch, the coroner's report notes, a common drugstore model, and it had stopped at 11:41. A quartz movement is an electric circuit, a battery, an oscillating crystal, a tiny stepping motor, and water intrusion shorts that circuit within minutes of submersion, which is why forensic examiners treat a stopped quartz watch as a timestamp in a way a wound mechanical watch never quite is. 11:41 is 51 minutes after Carol Ann told her husband she was starting across the lake, exactly the interval a slow crossing in ice fog, a stop at the ridge, and a walk ahead on foot would consume. It corroborates every element of the accident reconstruction, the trapper's timeline, the fuel burned by a machine idling from before midnight until the tank ran dry, and it forecloses everything else, because a person who died at 11:41 that night was alone on an empty lake while 4 card players could account for one another, and a sleeping man lay on a couch 9 miles away. The skeletal examination found no fractures and no trauma of any kind, and the finding entered in September of 2024 reads accidental cold water drowning. The RCMP closed the historical file the same month, and a spokesperson confirmed in the careful language such statements use that no other person was ever involved. Ray Beattie was 71 years old when the coroner's office called him in Whitehorse. He had lived under the weight of an unanswered question for 19 years, and under the weight of his neighbors' answers to it for nearly as long. And there is a line from the family's statement at the memorial that I will simply read as written. The lake did not only give us back Carol Ann, it gave Ray back his name. He came back to Faro that September for the first time in 14 years, and the memorial was held on the northwest shore, within sight of the bay, and by the accounts of people who were there, most of the town came, including, some of them surely, people who had once believed the rumor, which is its own kind of reckoning, the kind that happens quietly, at a graveside, without anyone saying the words. There is no villain in this one. There is a skin of gray ice 2 inches thick, and a careful woman doing the careful thing, and a probability map drawn 180 degrees wrong in perfectly good faith, and a lake that held what it was given for 19 winters, because the physics of cold, fresh water gave it no reason to let go. If there is a lesson, the old hands of the territory already know it. New ice over a lead does not announce itself. A warm spell in December is a trap that resets nightly, because the refrozen skin looks a little more like old ice every cold night after, and the crossing you have made several hundred times is only ever as old as the last thaw. The search and rescue people will add one more, that the first assumption drawn on the map is the hardest one to erase, because every resource that follows flows downhill from it. But mostly there is this. Somewhere under the lakes of the north, right now, other families' answers are resting at 4 degrees, waiting on a low water year, or a survey boat, or a hard southeast wind against rotten spring ice. Swift Lake kept its secret for 19 years, and then it opened its hand. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more cases from the cold edges of the map, and leave a like so the next one finds the people who will care about it the way you did. The stories start where the trees run out. I will see you at the next one.